This is Jeremiah Piper, and you're listening to Science from the Source. In today's episode, we discuss cycling, elite athletes, and magic as I speak with Paolo Menaspà, who is an early career researcher and currently the head of performance solutions with Cycling Australia. In this interview, Paolo discusses his thesis titled Analysis of Road Sprint Cycling Performance. And then we talk about the role that magic has within professional sport and how elite sport and performing arts should look to one another for ways to improve performance. Paolo joins us today from Adelaide via Zencastr. Well, Paolo, thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. It's my real pleasure.
Oh, great. You are an early career researcher, and you were doing a postdoc at Edith Cowan University. And as of today, you're currently unemployed, but that changes in 24 hours. And you're going to be the head of performance solutions with Cycling Australia. And so today we're going to talk a bit about that position and what it is that you're going to be undertaking in your new role for the next 3 years. And then we're going to discuss your thesis, which was titled Analysis of Road Sprint Cycling Performance. But the majority of the interview is going to be devoted to some draft opinion pieces or perspectives that you've been writing about how magic or performance arts might relate to elite athlete performance. And so we'll jump straight in, and you are soon to be the head of performance solutions with Cycling Australia. What does that mean?
So this is a new role, and it's fundamentally it's a role in support of the coaches. Coaches have very busy lives and have a lot of tasks, and so this role is it will be in support in order to simplify, helping prioritize and plan ahead, and with the main goal to help the cyclists to win gold medals in Tokyo. That's pretty much in a nutshell. There will be again some planning, and the title says solutions, so there will be a lot of just kind of sitting and watching, trying to identify opportunities for improvement.
And so with those opportunities, you're thinking more engaging within the literature in the field and then trying to implement that within sport performance, or are you more on the logistics side?
No, the former. So I'll be spending a fair bit of time, even just watching training session, going at some races to see where there might be some gaps in whether it's performance or logistic. I think it's a good question, and it's probably the reason why there is no science or sport science in the job title, because some of the solution might not be strictly related to like a research kind of output, but certainly there will be like a strong look for evidence-based solutions.
With this new role, are you going to be, your PhD was in road sprint cycling, but I'm assuming maybe a majority of your role is going to be looking at track cycling, or are you going to be still across multiple cycling disciplines?
Well, it's correct. It will be across, because we hope that some of the solution might be applied to other disciplines. But yeah, it's very likely that the majority of my time will be spent on the track, just because that's where the majority of the Olympic medals are.
And speaking of that, what do you think our best possibilities, or Australia's best possibilities for medals will be then coming from the track?
Well, I think we have really good talents and a very good system. I'm not going to name names. If you want, as you said, I'm still unemployed. I haven't even started. I've done my research, but certainly early to name names. Things can change a lot in the due course. But I think the Australian cycling team has certainly good possibility to win gold medals in Tokyo.
And your position is now you're located in South Australia.
Yeah.
How's that? So you've traveled around, and this kind of gets to my next question. You've been working elite sport for a long time, so you've been traveling quite a bit. Are you, with this new role, do you get to kind of stay a bit more established in an area, or are you going to do a lot of traveling still?
I expect it to be like a different way of traveling, meaning that in the last probably 5 or 6 years, I've been sort of chasing the summer. I've been just because they work with road cycling. Road cycling is pretty much a summer sport, so I actually spent roughly five or 6 months in Australia and 5 or 6 in Europe when the cycling season is on. So there was not a high amount of travel per se, meaning like time in the air, flying around, but a lot of time away. While now I think I'll be flying more frequently, going to more competitions, so a lot, but shorter travels, maybe like 2 days somewhere for a World Cup or 5 days. So I'll be based in Adelaide. The majority of my time will be in Adelaide, but I'll be traveling more if you want.
Well, that's good news, knowing that you have a new family too.
Yeah, correct. It would be good news. We are loving being in Adelaide. We've only been here 3 days, but so far so good.
And like I was saying, you've been working in elite sport for quite some time. And whenever I get a chance to interview someone who's in this area, I like to get your perspective on what it took to get to your position, because there are going to be a lot of PhD students or undergraduate students who are listening to this podcast wanting to work in elite sport, and the jobs are fairly scarce. And so I guess 2 questions. What do you really like about working in elite sport? And what are some of the recommendations you would give to someone who wants to work in this field? What do they need to do to kind of get their foot in the door?
Yes. So then what I like is the very unique environment. You are in a very special group of people. Everyone is extremely motivated and passionate about their jobs. I guess it happens in a lot of jobs. I just this might sound a bit strange, but we just moved here. As I said, we arrived in Adelaide 3 days ago, and we got removalists coming here and packing and unpacking. And to me, they look like Olympic champions of packing and unpacking. They were so good. So there is high performance, if you want, in a lot of areas. They were extremely motivated and professional and efficient. But sport, I don't know why, sport attracts a lot of attention from everyone, and everybody loves sport. So I guess the bar is a bit higher. As you said, it's difficult to get in, and maybe it's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating and you want to be in. So maybe that's what I like as well. And so I think this is the first part of the question, and then you are after some kind of suggestion on how to get in. I think personally, I think I've had a lot of luck as well in my life. I was the right person at the right moment a few times, and I started back in 2005 at MAPEI, which is a laboratory in the north the north of Italy, and pretty much almost, like, it's not totally true, but I just started there because it was the closest laboratory to home. So I was studying sports science in Italy. It was next door. I was looking for a job, and they were looking for someone with some experience in cycling. I was a former cyclist anyway, and so I got in again. Partially, I would say I was lucky, and then in that position, in that the head of the laboratory was Aldo Sassi, which is he was a really famous coach, and one of his athletes was Cadel Evans. So as you know, I was in the job 6 months. I was testing Cadel Evans and Mick Roger and all this sort of cyclists, and I think I got excited about the high performance and seeing all these champions, but. And it probably is also what, in the long term, got me into applying for a position in Australia, for a PhD in Australia.
And so it's interesting. You come into the MAPEI testing center, and you're instantly testing some of the world's best riders. And when you're testing those riders, can you think of one thing about elite athletes that sets them apart from non-athletes, and not just physiologically, so not VO2 max and not power? Is there something that when you meet someone who's at that level, you can tell, that they are at that level and they deserve to be at that level?
I think so, and just because further down the road we'll be talking about magic, I might quote a magician here, and David Copperfield, I would say, is one of the most famous magicians, certainly the richest magician in the world currently. I think like in 2018, he became a billionaire. And once I asked him how come he's so successful, and he had the 3 P's, which is passion. He mentioned about, he talked about passion, preparation, and persistence. And I think those 3 P's are probably common to all the elite athletes I see. They are extremely passionate about what they do. They are prepared, and as you say, it's not just prepared on the bike. They're prepared in life. They build their own life in a way that allow them to be successful. Whether they have amazing support from the family or they where they decide to live. There are so many little details that built up they are part of this preparation, but certainly they work hard, really hard all the time, not just to the point that sometimes being on the bike it's the easy part for them, and everyone is persistent as well, because there's no good career without some bad luck, bad season, or injuries, and you certainly need persistence.
And do you also think that those are key attributes that someone working within that field, so someone who's working a support role, should have the same 3 strengths in the same 3 areas?
I think so. Because somehow working in elite sport, you need the same desire to win. There is kind of the same level of competition. In going to the Olympic Games, of course, it's very difficult to be selected as an athlete, but it's not much easier to be selected whether you are a bike mechanic or you are a coach. Like there are a lot of people that they want to go to the Olympic Games, whether if it's just for the tracksuit or for the accreditation or for a photo, just a memory, something to share with your family. Like everyone wants to go to the Olympic Games, and so you do need passion, preparation, and persistence, even if you're a staff member. I think I might. In this case, I'll quote a cyclist, Matt Heyman, who's going to retire early next year. He just released a statement saying that he will retire, and he said something along those lines, that to be an athlete at that level, you have to be self-centered, selfish, driven, and to be a cyclist, so he also said you need to spend most of your life tired. Maybe not not if you're a staff member, but probably the other characteristic, being self-centered and driven, and they are also a part of, I guess, of the staff.
Yeah, that's some good words from Matt Heyman. 17 Grand Tours. I'm sure that he spent majority of those 17 years quite tired from training and racing.
Yeah.
And so the final question is just in this area. Again, a lot of people want to work in elite sport, and I'll be first to say that I was the same when I was a PhD student. I wanted to work in elite sport, but I don't think elite sport is for everyone. And so, what are your thoughts? Is it something that everyone should do or want to aspire to do, or is it not always for every person? And I'm talking about support roles here, so people working in the support areas.
Well, that's a good question. I would say the answer is it's not for everyone, but also because, and everyone will know what they want, because you need to, as you mentioned earlier on, you said I have a family, and I think a family has a big impact on your career decision and lifestyle. In my personal experience, I see some of the staff working in elite sport having situation that are very difficult, because with a lot of travel, it's difficult to keep up with the family and all the commitments, and it's about priorities. So I personally, I've been lucky enough that with all my travel, the one I mentioned earlier on, my wife works in sport. We worked very hard to make our calendar match. So we've been away and traveling pretty much together for 2 different jobs, but we were pretty much always in the same time zone. And but I see a lot of stuff leaving the challenge, and that part of the challenge. So yeah, sport maybe is not for everyone. You need to give up a lot of weekends, and some jobs aren't even that well paid, because there is a lot of competition. There would be like young sports scientists or young whatever strength and conditioning coaches that you want to jump in, and they're happy to do it for a bit less. And So I would say it's not for everyone. You need to be driven and all of that.
So we're going to transition from that point, and I want to get to the majority of the conversation today. I want to talk a bit about magic and performance. So I do want to talk about your thesis in general. And so you completed your thesis in 2015,
correct.
If I'm correct?
Yes.
And your thesis again was on the sprint characteristics or sprinting within a professional road cycling.
Correct.
Can you just discuss your thesis in general and what you were trying to achieve with your thesis and what you did achieve actually in the end, and how then maybe you use some of that information, maybe not so much in your current role where you're going to be doing more logistics, but in your previous role as a postdoc at ECU?
So I've always been interested in sprint performances in road cycling, and there wasn't, and still there isn't, much published on the topic. Part of the reason is because the relatively low number of sprinters in a whole bunch of cyclists in the whole professional scene. Generally, there is one or two sprinters per team, which means that even if you are embedded and you're working in a professional team, you have access to one or two subjects. And as you know, it's not easy to publish a lot when you have one or two subjects. And so that's one of the reasons why the literature on sprint cycling is really limited. So what I try to do, I try to look into the topic and from different angles. So I've been looking into the power demands or the physiology of road sprinting, but I've also tried to look into some of the more tactical aspects of it, look into the team support requirement, the course, like the profile of the race, the amount of climbing that you need to be able to climb or to overcome to get to a sprint. We're looking in sprint performances from a different point of view, with the ultimate goal of finding some answer that could be helpful for coaches and road cyclists.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point. We've worked on a few papers together, and that's one of the areas that I always find intriguing is that it's not just about the sprint. It's not always about how fast you can sprint, but there's a lot of logistical issues that go into a sprinter being in the correct position to be able to sprint in the first place. And so that means getting to the front of the group in the last couple hundred meters. That takes a bit of effort over the last 20 kilometers to make that happen. So do you think that some of the lack of research within the area of sprint performance is due just to the fact that there are so many confounding variables that impact sprints in the first place?
Yeah, very likely, yes. Because it is complicated, and you might end up, collecting lots of data to then find out that the most powerful sprinter is not even the one winning, which I think that it's a reality. And sometimes not even the fastest, because, when you're talking about power is just one component of speed, because if a cyclist is very big and not very aerodynamic, we go, it's very powerful, but it's not fast, that's why it's not winning. But sometimes not even the fastest wins, because if you're starting, as you said, you're starting your sprint way back into the middle of the bunch of cyclists, you're not going to win. So there is a lot of positioning, there is aerodynamic, there are so many variables that I suspect for a few years they've kind of discouraged people to start doing research in that area.
And so from your research findings, I know you also coach a few athletes. Do you try to incorporate into the things that you have learned throughout your thesis within your own coaching?
You'd be surprised if I say yes, because it would be silly not to. So of course I do. And just to give, I imagine there won't be many cycling coach listening, but for in case there is someone, for example, we work more on what happens before the sprint at the sprint itself. Because it's one of the things we've seen within my PhD, like being able to cope with the increase of intensity in the last probably 10 minutes, 15 minutes is likely to be more challenging than the sprint itself. And it's also where you have bigger room for improvement. And personally, it was good. And, that's the results of the research. But then reading some books, autobiographies and interviews, it's also what I found out that also pro cyclists generally do. A lot of, I'm talking about sprinters, a lot of them, they spend a lot of time training their climbing ability in order to make sure that they make it to the finish line.
Well, that makes sense. That means that the more likely you are to make it to the finish line, the more likely you can actually sprint for a win in the first place. And so, again, it's just interesting that it's beyond just the sprint. And as you said with your own athletes, that you incorporate some of the things you learned about the time coming into the sprint, which becomes more important for some, at least, or in some areas of aspects. And so let's say a cyclist is listening to this podcast or a coach is listening to this podcast. I was thinking your thesis was quite large, had lots of different studies involved in it. What would be the single take-home message that you would give to somebody from your thesis that might help with either their coaching or their cycling in general?
The take-home message is that everything that's not the sprint is more important. Like if I was a team manager and I want my sprinter to win, I would put money into teammates and the special training camps to organize a lead out and all of that to make sure that the team actually is able to support the sprinter 100%. More than, investing on the sprinter. It's improving the sprint ability of the sprinter itself. Of course, you need a cyclist able to win, but I would, again, work on all what's not the pure sprint.
That's an interesting point. Can you train anybody to become a sprinter? And I don't believe you can. I think that there's certain people who just have attributes that are suited to be a sprinter. And I think that some of those attributes not only are physical, but they're mental attributes that allow someone to take risks that maybe other people won't. So is it possible to, let's say you are a manager of a team or you're coaching a team, and you want to try to make somebody a sprinter. Is it possible to make them a high level sprinter if they don't have those kind of attributes in the first place?
Only if you're a magician. No, I think I totally agree with you. I think you pretty much are born sprinter, not just because of your physiology, but the ability to take a risk and the skills and all of that. So I think it's very, very difficult. And again, if I was a team manager, I'd rather get a good sprinter and put around him or her a good support rather than trying to make someone improve or transform the person into a sprinter.
Okay, and that was a great segue into the next section. So it's going to take a bit of magic to make somebody into a sprinter. And you, I think I noticed that you're a fan of magic from following you on Twitter, and I know you post here and there about magic and magicians and deception. And so I wanted to have a chat to you today about what role you think magic plays within elite sport. But before we start with that, I just want to know, how long have you been a fan of magic, and why are you a fan of magic? What is it about magic that draws you to it?
Thanks for the question. I think I've been passionate about magic for a long period of time, probably more than 20 years. And what made me passionate about magic was probably initially I was more into what I think in English you call it like scientific skepticism. Like there are a group of people or writers. They're generally popular science writer that they I would say they care about truth, and so they talk about in their article, in their magazine and columns they talk about whether it's health or. They are often, I think you might call them debunker as well. And a very famous one, and probably one of the first person I've read some of his articles was Martin Gardner. He's an American writer. Has been, I think, for 30 years a columnist on Scientific Americans. And again, one of his biggest passion was being a skeptic and being against pseudoscience. He wrote books and a lot of columns on it. And just searching for truth, for honesty, and all of that. And magicians, because, and when I refer to magician, of course, I'm talking about performers. People, no one claims to have any magic power. They are just performing artists. But magicians are the kind of the most honest people, because they kind of trick you, telling you that I'm going to trick you. So that there's nothing more honest than that, if you want. And since probably the early 20th century, I would say Houdini, he was a skeptic as well, because he would have been fighting against people claiming to have real power of reading minds, or going from place to place and communicating with their minds and stuff like that. And Houdini was famous for just saying it, it's all tricks. I think one of his quotes was like, my brain is the key that sets me free. So there is no magic. It's all in my brain, because I think there are solutions, etc., etc. And Martin Gardner was a kind of a modern skeptic, and was defending science. I think in his career, he has been criticizing the use of vaccines and et cetera, because just in defense of science. So I got into that first, and then I realized that partially, I might mention another famous magician, because I haven't said it yet, but Martin Gardner was also super passionate about magic. And but another an American magician was James Randi, who is still alive, and he has published a couple of papers on magic as well. And but what he did back in the 80s, he did this project when I think in the 80s there was a lot of belief in this, the possibility to read minds and stuff and things like that. I think even the CIA, the Americans, they put a lot of money into researching if it was possible to win war against the Russians or stuff like that with the power of mind. There's actually also a movie. Back to James Randi, he was part of a project of this, they call it Project Alpha. Basically, there were universities studying ESP and pseudoscientific theories, and he prepared two magicians and he sent them as a subject, volunteer of this research. And after a couple of years of research, the university thought that these two guys were able to read minds, and so that they were actually ready to publish papers on the fact that it's not fake, it's all real. And but then they declared that they were magicians. And I got a bit lost into my description of the whole story, but what I was trying to say is that sometimes you need a magician to see things that maybe scientists or other people can't see. So both Martin Gardner and James Randi have been always been able to connect and been able to put together science and magic just in defense of truth with a capital T.
So really, your love of magic comes from also maybe your love of science and vice versa.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
And you recently sent me a few draft papers. Now they're not published, but they're in draft, and they're ideas that you've had around kind of the idea of magic and its place within performance arts, as well as or performance artists within their place within elite sport, and magic within elite sport. And a couple of the papers you sent me, really, there's some things that caught my attention. And one is the idea of deception in sport performance. And you talk about deception, sport performance, and the placebo effect. Would you be able to discuss that a bit?
Yeah, well, I think there are really different ways and several ways in which being passionate about magic or knowing a bit more about magic can help, whether you are a sports scientist, a coach, or even an athlete. And I might give you a little example in again using Copperfield himself again. He did a show not long ago. I think it was part of that thing called Top 10 trick plays in the NFL in the US, where he described those trick plays that players do, and they are the deceptive moves in order to to trick the opponents into going in the wrong direction. And that's pretty much an illusion, a kind of a magic trick played on the field. And in combat sport, I believe they're called feint, when all those the deceptive move that they are meant to trick the opponent, the thinking that you are doing one move and then you go at them in another one, would be in boxing or fencing, etc., etc. So I think from better understanding of magic, or understanding some of these the tricks or what happens behind the scenes, can help organize or improve those, for example, those trick plays. But you also you mentioned placebo, and of course deception is part of using placebo effect and nocebo effect. And there are some interesting articles that now I can't really recall in details, but few articles, again, perspective, some published even in Nature Neuroscience. Pretty much they say that, that by studying magicians and their technique, neuroscientists or scientists can learn different methods to manipulate attention and in the laboratory. So again, there are ways to improve the use of deception in science. I think in the article you mentioned, in the draft, not even an article, in the draft you mentioned, I was using an example of a study where athletes, they were using a supplement, but the supplement was a placebo, and they were lifting some weight, but the weight was actually reduced by the researchers. So the subject didn't know, and the placebo, what they thought was a supplement, was more effective, even when the weight went back to the original weight. And there are some magic tricks that work in a they've been used with a very similar concept.
It's interesting you bring up American football in terms of deception, because when I was reading that draft you sent me, that was the first thing I thought about, was just the way that within certain sports, and NFL is a very good example. There's many plays where the idea is to trick not only the players on the field, also to trick the defensive coordinator or offensive coordinator, however you want to see it, in terms of how the individuals line up. And so just by giving them a different look, it may prompt a response that is what you want. So you're trying to trick a team into doing something, or you're trying to trick a team into not doing something. And so it's interesting that you use that as your example, because that's exactly what I was thinking when reading your paper.
I have to say one thing, like as I talk out loud about, because this is the very first time I talk publicly about magic. Like, well, I mean, I've been passionate for 20 years, but generally it's not something I discuss and I share a lot. And there is this thing about magicians. In some of the books about magic, they say, which is one of the reasons why I find it interesting, because, you need to really, it falls into the skill acquisition. So as a person, and I'm talking, myself, I like to practice a bit, or waste some of my time, because I think it kind of makes me a better person, a more skillful person. And anyway, this quote that you often read in magic books, you say that a magician it must say something while you are actually doing something else with your hand, and so the brain is already working on two different levels. But at the same time, you need to think of a third thing that's going to happen, in the future. So, and as I'm doing this chat with you, I realize that's why I'm not a magician, because I'm just thinking at the next topic, but then I can't finish my sentence. I'm taking notes, so probably that's why I'm not a professional magician. I know a bit of the theory, but I can't really put it together.
Well, no, I think you're doing fine, and thanks then for being if you don't share this often, this is the first place you're going to share it. So it's interesting. I think that your ideas, if you think about what you're saying and you watch sport, it's there and you can see it. It's just not very many people put it on this level.
No, because you say that, you just say you watch sport and it's there. I totally agree. The other day I read somewhere an article, when they've done the world record in the marathon, and I've read somewhere that someone was saying that the performance is as much as an athletic performance, as much as an artistic masterpiece, because it can be for someone would be totally meaningless, and someone is the most meaningful thing in the world, and which is again a bit like art. Someone like wouldn't go in a museum because it's totally meaningless, and someone is the most beautiful thing. And so, yeah, I agree. Sport. That's why I believe sport falls within the performing arts category.
Well, that is a fantastic segue to my next question, because my next question was about you're discussing the idea of athletes or elite athletes as performance artists, and you wrote another draft letter, and the title was "When Failure is Not an Option: Insights from Show Business." And there's a quote in there that says that sports scientists and coaches could learn alternative ways to monitor and improve their athletes' awareness and manipulate their opponents' attention in the field if they treat them. If they come from the angle of the performance artist. And so maybe if you could talk about that for a few minutes, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. So that was a draft that I thought about it when Dave Martin and Shona Halson wrote a piece on learning from defense, basically from the army. I thought it was an interesting piece, but which simply made me think about learning from other categories or other professionals. And personally, I feel that there might be more stronger connection with other professions. For example, performing artists. And I actually got in touch with both of them, and shared the idea. And I think they kind of liked my point of view. I think they kind of agreed on it. But then we never got to finish the draft, and because none of us is working in the performing, like in the real performing arts. There are a lot of things in common, and I love, for example, athletes perform in front of a crowd. And that article, when you compare athletes to army or defense, that I see it as a big difference. Like, there is no pressure from a cheering crowd. You're not playing in the MCG with 70,000 people yelling at you. So like athletes, same as performing artists, they need to be able to cope with the pressure of a crowd looking at you. Similarly, the media, artists and athletes, nowadays, they even for sponsor reason, they must be connected with social media, and they might be criticized on the media, and they need to look after their image and cope with journalists, all things that they are not really part of the army domain. But disregarding of the army, I think there are more things in common between performing artists and athletes. For example, a lot of performing artists, they travel a lot. If you think about singers or bands, they might be in a tourney and they change, go to different states, different time zones, and which is what happens, for example, here in Australia. If you are playing in different states, there is a lot of travel going on, and you might have different time zones, and again in the footy, you might need to play in the evenings, and that simply happens because of the show. It doesn't happen because of the optimal physiological performances at night. It just happens because it's a show. I think actually what I think was defined as the biggest boxing match in history in the last century, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman was like a schedule at 4 a.m. Because the match was actually in Africa, but was scheduled in a friendly time for in the US. So yeah, again, athletes they often share a lot of things with performing artists. And if you look into research, not much, but there is some research into, for example, musicians and warm up, injury prevention in circus and this sort of performing arts. There are some studies, not many, but about extending a career, both in whether it's in ballet and dance and in athletes. So that's where I see a lot of things in common.
So do you think then that you always see similarities physically between some performance art and athletics. So let's just take consideration dancing. So ballet dancing is a very powerful sport, or it's powerful art, and that can translate across to many sports. But do you think that when you're talking about the similarities between the two, are you speaking more on a psychological level, or are you speaking more on a physical level?
Well, that's a good question, and would be maybe something for a researcher or a PhD student looking into that, just to see what is more important. Because if I go back to a question you asked earlier on, the champion, for a champion, when you test a champion, you ask me, don't talk about the VO2 max, and I guess the reason was because what is more important, and it's difficult to know what's more important. There are a lot of people with a very high VO2 max that they're not champions, and on the other hand, a lot of people with extremely passion but they don't have a VO2 max. So I think it's just the combination, and only the few that they have the very high physical characteristic or physiological characteristic, and they're very high in the mental and in the passion, etc. And they are also lucky; they are the one actually making it. I think the level of competition to be a successful singer, for example, might be even higher than or harder than being successful athletes. I actually do remember a cyclist saying, and this is 100% true story, and saying that she picked cycling because she wanted to be kind of famous, and she picked cycling because singing was just too difficult. 100% true story. Right. Yeah.
Well, that got me thinking is, in terms of the psychological aspect, and one of the things that came to my mind is just the idea of stage fright. If you think about maybe someone who's in the performance arts, a singer, a dancer, who has to perform, and they have to perform relatively perfect for a prolonged period of time in front of the large group, as opposed to, and not taking away anything from professional athletes, but let's think something like Australian Leagues football. There's large periods of time on a field where, yes, you're in front of 100,000 people, but you're not being asked to do a finite skill perfectly. You may be running, you may be walking, you may be moving around. But then when you take a mark and you're being asked to kick a goal in front of 70,000 or 100,000 people, that becomes a much different scenario. And so I can see a real connection between the psychology of that performing under such scrutiny between those two different disciplines. And I guess my point is, do you think that there's a place for then athletes to learn from those in performance arts? And if so, how do you think that could be integrated into sport?
Thanks for this question. What I think is that I don't have a definite answer, but in my opinion, what we should do is to look into the relationship both ways, and we need to learn from who's best at doing that. And I'll give you an example, a very practical example. I went not long ago, I was still in Italy. I like opera, and I went to see this performance at the Arena in Verona, which is a Roman theater, and it's an outdoor theater. And despite it was 8 p.m., it was still 34 degrees. And the leading character as a singer is probably around 72 years old, very famous singer. And it was like, if I said it was 35 degrees, I can't remember if I said it. Yeah, so it was very hot. This guy is 72, and they're singing with costumes that because of traditional reasons, they're like probably 20. I don't know. I haven't weighted them, but I guess they're 20 kilos costumes. And I've seen some photos in the newspaper the following days. This guy was like really, really, really sweaty, like in the first area, which would be like the opening area, the big song. Let's call it like that. And so, for example, I do believe as a sports scientist, while I was watching the singer, I was thinking for sure they can benefit from not a sports scientist, but like a performing arts scientist, someone trying to implement, I don't know, some cooling strategies or something to change the way they are dressed up, or you for sure you can work with different fabric, making the costume lighter, etc., etc., etc. So in that example, I think the performing artists could potentially learn from the sport, but there are probably a lot of I've never worked in high performance arts, meaning like, with a theater or with actors, but there are probably some areas where the sport can learn from the show business, which is why I think it would be good just to learn and to share and to ask questions, because there is probably a mutual benefit.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, just from today, I think you've opened up a whole new area for sports scientists who are graduating now. They can become performance arts scientists. Yeah. So you've given a whole new career pathway.
I would hope so. And sometimes because of this passion, I often try to listen to interviews, and so I listen to some interviews. Some actors, like from movie to movie, they need to put on and lose 20 kilograms and sometimes muscle. And I know they're not on the WADA, so they might use some different strategies, but for sure they have a lot of motivation. Like, it's not easy to put on and lose 20 kilos anyway, whatever method you use. And for sure, it is likely they're doing something that I'm not aware of. So, and back in the sport, combat sport, they have a massive thing going on with putting on weight and before competition or before checking the weight, etc., etc. So I wonder if there is something that can be learned there about strategies and methods. And let me say, sorry, just to an extra note why I think about it. It's not just, I don't think it's just for the athletes. It could be, again, a sports scientist or coaches. I was watching some interviews of orchestra directors, and it was so clear to me how the director is like a coach, It goes like you coach in a team, you talk to your athletes, you need to motivate them and get the most out of them. And that's what an orchestra director does. Technically, the orchestra can almost play without him. And in the same way, like a team or a soccer team or whatever, they can play without a coach. But the coach is there to get the most out of them. And there are so many connections at different levels.
Well, thanks for that, Paolo. You have some fascinating ideas, and I could listen to them all day, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. I do want to just, before we end, I want to make sure that anybody who's listening to the podcast, these ideas interesting, which I'm more than sure they will. You've introduced possibly a new area of study, so performance arts scientists. You've talked a lot about the need for research within the area, and that might pique people's interest. So if someone was interested in this and they wanted to talk to you more about it, or they wanted to contact you about possibly setting up some research studies, what would be the best way for someone to contact you?
Well, very likely my email address, which is just my name and surname at gmail.com. I can Paolo Menaspà at gmail.com. But I do, even if sometimes I just miss them, I do read messages on Twitter as well. So feel free to use whatever way to contact me.
And before we go, I just, again, want to thank you so much for taking the time. I know you've just moved. I know you've just got to your house and got everything set up. So I know it's a little bit chaotic there. But I really do appreciate you taking the time today to talk to me. And so I just want to thank you for coming on the show. I want to thank you for taking your time. And I hope that this was a process that you enjoyed.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for inviting me.
That concludes another episode of Science from the Source. If you enjoyed the podcast, please help support the show by telling your family and friends. If you would like to contact me to discuss the podcast or any of the content, please feel free to contact me via Twitter at Jeremiah Piper or by email at sciencefromthesource, that's all one word, @gmail.com.